Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Wealth Conversation podcast with me, Tsitsi Mutiti. I guide high-achieving women on their journey to build lasting wealth so they can prepare for an abundant future in every area of their life. I hope that today's episode will help you to transform your relationship with money so you can make the choices that will enable you to create the opportunities and lasting wealth that you desire. Let's get straight into this week's episode. Hey there, it's good to have you back with us. So I know you've been listening to this podcast every single week and that you've been taking in the wealth of knowledge from all the guests that have been on the podcast so far. But a lot of you have told me that you haven't taken any action, mainly because you're not sure where to start. And I get it, because I've been there before. The good news is that I can definitely help you get clear on the 3 steps that you can take straight away to create the solid foundation that you desire. So head to the show notes and click the link to book a Power Hour session with me. There's definitely never been a better time to become the designer of your financial future. Investing is one of the many ways to build wealth. But how can you invest in a way that has a positive impact on global issues and is in alignment with your beliefs? Financial planner Emily Poole is passionate about empowering people to invest their wealth sustainably and in line with their personal values. In this episode, Emily will be sharing why she believes that ethical and sustainable investing is a key part of anyone's wealth journey. Welcome, Emily, to the Wealth Conversation podcast.
Hi, Tsitsi. Lovely to be here.
I'm so looking forward to this discussion on ethical and sustainable investing, which is a topic that has gained momentum in recent years. And I think it's, the right thing that we should be focusing on this. But before we go into that topic, could you share a bit more about yourself and your background?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Emily Poole. I'm an independent financial planner and also a will writer. I have recently just established my own brand called Happy Planet Financial Planning. And this has really been my passion project, which I think probably came about, as a seed implanted in my mind right at the beginning of COVID, actually, because not long ago, I wrote a blog saying that I thought that if the ethical and sustainable investing was going to be a much bigger thing as a result of COVID. And I'm really pleased to say that that little seed I planted in my own mind at that time when I wrote that blog has blossomed into my passion project and my new brand of ethical and sustainable investing. Before doing this, I spent quite a long time working in the city. I worked for the RBS Group and I did infrastructure project finance. So putting debt into infrastructure projects and working on renewables deals, wind and solar and things. So I have a little bit of a sort of sustainable background myself doing that. But I jumped out of the banking life in 2017 and decided I wanted to do something that would allow me a better work-life balance and allow me to spend a bit more time with my children. So here I am.
Fantastic. We're talking about ethical and sustainable investing today. But before we do that, could you tell us what your definition of investing is?
Yeah, if you were to look it up in the dictionary, I'm sure that it would probably have quite a financial slant on it. And of course, there is a financial slant on investing. But I also really draw the distinction between spending and investing. And I think investing comes into everything we do. I think that when we make choices with our money, whether it's to save, which some people might think is investing, I would slightly disagree, depending on how well you're actually doing in terms of the return you're getting, which is, as we know, quite low when it comes to cash rates at the moment. But when we look at spending and how we use our money, we can go to the shops and we can buy something that fulfills a very short-term need. We scratch that itch. When we are a little bit more long-term, with our spending, and we buy something because we know it's going to bring us a benefit in the future. That is also investing. And I think that ties in nicely with the ethical and sustainable investing, because this is what we are doing. We are investing in stocks and shares and other financial instruments, the same you would in conventional investing. But you are doing it very much with a long-term view and with an idea that it's going to bring benefits, maybe not just to yourself. Obviously, you are hoping to make a return, but you're hoping that it's also going to bring benefits to the wider society and to the world that we live in. So that's my sort of, in a nutshell, view of what investing is. It's about having a longer term view and doing it really with the intention of wider benefits.
Love that, and completely agree with that in terms of the difference between the normal investing that people tend to talk about and ethical and sustainable investing. The latter, ethical and sustainable investing, is about thinking beyond yourself and beyond your family, but thinking globally and thinking about the planet. So there are many reasons why individuals start investing, including receiving a return on their investment, as you've mentioned. But when it comes to ethical and sustainable investing, it seems as if, or at least that's what it's seemed like in the past, that the primary motivation is not return. So why would people invest in specific ethical and sustainable products and funds rather than conventional ones?
Okay, well, I think it is a question of conscience. And I am not cynical enough to believe that people don't have a conscience. I think that some people believe they don't have a conscience. I think if people dig deep enough, I think everybody has a conscience. I just think people choose not to listen to it. And I feel very much that if you are going to be putting your money somewhere, let's first of all, break that down. It is your money and it's not someone else's. And when you put your money into your pension to make a return for your future, I just think that it's important that what that money is invested in is going to support your values. So if you listen to your conscience, if somebody was to say, okay, let's have a look at your pension plan, for example, and see what it's invested in, and you see that perhaps it's invested in sectors and companies that don't fit your values, and how does that make you feel? I think that's often when someone's conscience will say, actually, given that, my aunt, had a horrible long fight with lung cancer or something, that actually I'm not happy that my pension is 10% invested in tobacco companies. Or maybe you feel strongly about human rights and you feel that there is a company that you're invested in that hasn't got a great human rights record because it's involved in, I don't know, say the arms trade, or, dodgy dealings in countries where there's not the ethical behavior that you might expect. So until you dig deep and look at how your money is invested in your pension for your future, you just don't know what you're funding. And I just think that listening to your conscience with all of those things is going to really help steer you as to how you should be invested. And actually, I'll just say that there is a great campaign out there. It's called Make Your Money Matter, hashtag Make Your Money Matter. And it was launched by Richard Curtis, the film director. He did 4 Weddings and a Funeral. I'm sure you'll recognize his name, but it's a great movement. And if anyone's interested, look it up on Google and have a look. And there's some really interesting little videos there that they interview people and they suggest, how would you feel if your pension was invested in this? And loads of people have very strong reactions to the various companies and sectors that their pensions are invested in. And that just goes to show that there is a conscience there that we ought to be listening to, because what we spend and what we invest our money in is casting a vote for the future that we want. And it's the planet and the world that we're going to be giving to our children and our grandchildren.
Oh, I love that. What we spend and what we invest in is casting a vote. That is so true, because actually that money that you are giving to the company to buy shares in or to invest in, it actually gives you a proportion of that company, right? You own that small proportion. So you are voting with your money that, yes, I'm happy with these practices to continue. And it's really important to think about what you value, what you want the future to hold for not just the next generation, but generation after generation, and how it's going to impact the planet that we are living in. Now, there's so many different labels when it comes to this type of investing, ethical and sustainable investing, green investing, impact investing. Are these all the same things, or are there slight differences between them?
There are often all slight differences between them. You will find often that there are people who will be wanting to do all of them within a portfolio. And there are others who just want to focus on a particular area. And that's fine. And that just comes down to knowing what your own personal values are. And obviously, when we're talking about sustainable investing, there's a bit of an environmental lens to that. It's talking about making sure that we have a regenerative circular economy, that the companies that we're investing in are mindful of the resources that they're taking out, and they're making sure that their net effect on the world is at least neutral. When we swing a bit more towards having more of a positive impact, what they're trying to do there is they're trying to actually have a net positive effect on the world. But yeah, the sustainable sector, it is just making sure that environmentally we're doing everything to give the planet a fighting chance in the future, really, is the way I'd put it. And, ethical, that tends to be everything that is not sustainable in a way. That's more the views that people might have about certain things. So the classic ethical negative screens that people have will be, actually, I don't agree with tobacco companies because that is has having a negative effect on people's health, so I want to take that out. Or I don't agree with adult entertainment, for example. I don't want to invest in anything to do with that because that is degrading to women. That is not the kind of world that I want to live in. Other areas might be any sort of company or sector that might be employing slave labor, particularly child labor. Just trying to think of some more ethical areas. I mean, actually, if you look at ethical investing, it's been around for a very long time. In the US during the Vietnam War, a lot of investors were using their investment to tell the government, to tell the world, we don't agree with the Vietnam War. We also have various religious sects also that say they don't agree with certain things, and that they employ their ethics, their religious beliefs, to sort of screen out certain areas. Ethics, it can be very, very subjective. No one person's ethics are the same, though I would say that there are some general themes. And it is rare, I think, that I find somebody who is ethical but not sustainable. I do often find people who are sustainable but not ethical, but the two don't always go hand in hand, but most often they do.
I get the whole sustainable part where it's about making sure that we're not causing additional damage, and if anything, trying to fix some of the damage that's happened to the planet and thinking about the future. And I have come across instances where that whole ethical debate is quite difficult with clients because they may want a certain return, but they don't want to invest in certain areas because of their strong beliefs. On the other hand, some people want to invest in maybe companies that may not seem as ethical, but they're hoping that they can use their vote to turn some of those business practices around. But all in all, it is really about creating positive change, and having a voice when it comes to some of the practices that are being done by companies and maybe governments, as you've mentioned with the Vietnam War example. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, another example of that, I mean, I had a client recently who was very keen to avoid pharmaceuticals. And when it came down to it, I had a good debate with her about it. And I think that's why it is so great to work with a financial advisor who can help you see the wider picture. And that's not to say we're trying to persuade people to think differently, but I think it's useful for them to make investing decisions with the wider picture. So, for example, you said that sometimes if you leave out certain areas of the market or the investing universe, that you might be missing out on some return. So it's important for me to explain to clients who are saying they don't want to invest in pharmaceuticals that, yeah, obviously, if they do that, they are going to miss out on that good return that is being driven by the pharmaceutical sector. And then I try to very much understand why they don't want to invest in pharmaceuticals. And in this case, with this client I'm recalling, she was against animal testing. So we had a really good chat about animal testing. We talked about some of the companies that were pioneering the 3 R's rule. I won't tell you what those 3 R's are, but basically it's a very sustainable and humane way of dealing with animals. In that it is absolutely necessary to use them in order to create a pharmaceutical sector that is going to deliver medications and treatments for people that are going to be safe. So if you keep that into the wider picture and understand that, they are treating the animals humanely, really great conditions, they're not testing unnecessarily, and there is a humane way of dealing with those. And once she understood that she would only be investing in those kind of companies when she was looking at investing ethically and sustainably, she did feel a lot better. And then, of course, I did also use the argument that you just raised, Tsitsi, about the stewardship, about saying, well, you can actually, as an investor, also use your vote. So obviously shareholders get to vote on certain things. Your fund manager through these ethical and sustainable funds ought to be representing the views of their investors. So as long as you can make your views known, they will be able to represent those accordingly at any shareholder meetings. And also I should just say, if anyone is interested, there is an organization called Share Action, and Google that, and that will really help you understand what your stewardship rights are as an owner of a company. And that can make you feel extremely empowered. So I do urge people to have a look at that.
Great. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. Thank you, Emily. So you gave us an example of one of your clients and, the whole thing about them not wanting to invest in pharmaceuticals. How do you actually go about establishing your clients' values when it comes to how they're going to invest going forward? Is there anything else in addition to the conversations that you have with them that you do?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a fairly new area for financial advisors in this country. Many people might not know this, but the EU, when we were in it, were dictating that financial advisors should have very in-depth conversations with their clients to find out what their ethical and sustainable views are. And obviously we came out of the EU, so it's not mandated at the moment, but advisors and planners are being encouraged to do this now. And I do understand that there is going to be some more formal guidance, possibly even some regulations coming in later this year. So I would say that if your planner or advisor is not having these conversations with you, I would start that conversation with them, because if it's important to you, it ought to be important to them that your portfolios reflect your values. Okay, to answer the question, how do we find out what those values are? That is actually very tricky, I think, and it does come down to relationship. If you've got a good relationship with your planner or advisor should know you very well. If you're going to someone new for the first time, it is really about having a really decent conversation with them. It's not for me to say, oh, okay, what kind of return are you hoping to target? I mean, if I talk to you about what you're wanting to invest for, what your goal is for a certain pot of money, then obviously we'll agree what that growth target should be. And that's actually quite straightforward. But when it comes to how that money should be invested, because you want it invested in line with your values, yeah, that's when we've got to take the step back and say, well, what are your values? Some people can be really clear on it. Some people might say, actually, I haven't really given it much thought. And so it's about you asking questions and teasing out the right kind of information that might help inform you as to what are the things you really care about. So I don't know, let's be generalists here and just make some generalizations. For example, somebody who might have children might care very much about issues to do with children, for example. They might feel very strongly every child should be entitled to a good education. Well, in that fact alone may really help to inform some of the areas that you might like to be invested in. Education projects. There are some major companies out there having huge positive impact that are focusing in on education, and especially in the developing world, where we all know that really is a need. And for example, there might be other things. Somebody might have a dog, and you might start saying, oh, tell me about your dog, or, and then it's clear that person is an animal lover. We might say, oh, do you take an interest in politics? What debates of the day are grabbing your attention? And then that would then inform what you're keeping tabs on in terms of what's happening in current affairs. You might say, oh, do you do anything in your spare time? And it might transpire that they're a volunteer at a charity. Well, that, if people are giving up their free time to do things for charity, again, that informs, oh, this person really cares about, this sector of the community that they've chosen to work with on that basis. There's no set list, although I do have a questionnaire to get me started. But especially on the ethics side, it is about digging deep and getting to know your client. And maybe having a little bit of a values exercise where you write charts, and there's ways of doing it. There's all sorts of tools out there that can really help if clients are struggling to actually pinpoint what those values are.
And I think also for anyone listening who's thinking about ethical and sustainable investing, the point you've made about the individual being clear about what they want to achieve, the impact that they want their actions to have on the planet and for the next generation is key, because an advisor can only take you so far, and it is all down to you. We don't have all the answers, and also we don't read minds. So it's really important for people to be able to articulate what they feel, and then we can translate that into, a portfolio or a strategy that will be suitable for them.
Yeah. And actually, you bring me on to another point that I was actually going to raise, because obviously you're a financial coach, and I know that financial coaches spend a lot of time talking to people about their values, because people should be living financially in line with their values in order to make them happy. And it was raised at a meeting that I was at with the Initiative for Financial Wellbeing the other day, that anyone who is needing help establishing what their values are could really benefit from talking to a financial coach. So yes, if your planner or advisor is wanting you to deliver your list of values, and you're not quite there yet and isn't able to help you tease them out, then maybe that would be an opportunity to have a couple of sessions with a financial coach, because the coaches, I think, are a lot better at having those softer skills based conversations where they dig a bit deeper to find out what those values are.
Yeah, no, that's 100% correct. And I think what coaches focus on is everything but the money. And I think when a client comes to a financial coach, they are a bit more flexible when it comes to the conversation. When they go to a planner or an investment manager, they're really focused on the money, and they want to understand about return, etc. So building your team of financial experts, from coach to wealth manager and financial planner or advisor, is I think a good thing for anyone to do, have those three available to you. Earlier on, you mentioned about people looking at their pensions and understanding what's invested in there, and then sort of comparing that to what they feel are their ethical and sustainable values. But how can someone practically, who's got investments in an ISA or a pension, go about establishing whether their investments are ethical? If they were to pick up their valuation or look at their list of holdings, what are the 2 or 3 things you'd advise them to do?
Okay, well, the first thing is to find out what fund you're invested in. I mean, if it's an occupational pension plan, the chances are you've been risk rated, which means that they found out how much risk you want to take, and they've put you in their default portfolio. Now, depending on when you went into that fund or portfolio, will depend whether or not you've got much of a ethical or sustainable slant on it. If you've been in it a long time, the chances are there would have been no screening out of anything that might offend people with certain sensitivities. So you need to look at what that fund is. There's a thing called TrustNet that is available on the internet. And if you Google TrustNet and then the name of the fund that you're in, you ought to be able to get a fact sheet up that would at least tell you what the top 10 investments are, which would give you a very good flavor really for what the portfolio is invested in. It might be a bit more difficult to find a fuller list, but try that to start with and just see what the top 10 are, because you might be quite surprised as to how you're making your returns within your pension there. There is an amazing new tool out there it's called Tomelo. And it was a venture. It is a venture led by a very bright lady called Georgia Stewart. And she's providing this technology to occupational pension plans so that when their members inquire as to how they're invested, they can answer those questions for them. And that my understanding is that will give a really thorough response as to how you're invested and how ethical and sustainable your portfolios are. So that's on the pension side. I mean, the ISA side, I don't think that it has any insight into ISAs at this stage. But again, look at who your ISA is with, find out the name of the funds. It might be that you're invested in more than one funds if you've got an ISA. And presumably a lot of people self-select their own funds for their ISAs. So you would have hopefully had a little look about what you're investing in when you made those decisions. But if that was some time ago and you hadn't heard of ethical and sustainable investing at that point, then you might feel that it's worth looking a little bit deeper as to what you're invested in. Again, look at the top 10 funds through looking at TrustNet. And just look at the sectors that those companies are in. Let's pick an example. Say Nestle, a large company involved in the food market. But I remember back in the 70s there were some controversies around Nestle because they were pushing powdered baby milk into the developing world when that wasn't really considered the ethical thing to do. That's obviously subjective. You might not have a view on that, but for some people, they didn't want to touch Nestle. There's other companies out there. Tesla is a very controversial stock. Obviously, it's doing its best to, deliver on the sustainability agenda because it is not using fossil fuels to run the cars. But there are other elements of Tesla that other people are not happy with. So if you find the list of companies, it might be immediately that what sector they're in and what they're up to. But if you're not sure, just Google them. Google news around those companies and just to get a little bit of a sense as to what they're involved in and what they're up to. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of research. An easier way of doing it is, of course, to work with an independent financial planner who is able to help steer you on the right way there.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think one thing that people forget is you can actually ring up some of your providers and ask the question. They might be able to do the screening for you much quicker, or at least give you a little bit of information that you can take away and then work on.
A lot of default pension schemes now do have an ethical, sustainable portfolio. I don't want to really say any more than that, other than that it's a label that they will give certain portfolios, but it is important to understand what sits behind that label. And yeah, like you say, call the provider, ask them some questions about it. Tell me about what this portfolio is. How have you screened out? What choices have you made? Have you got certain sectors in it, that you might feel strongly about? Just ask them the questions just to check.
It's really important. Now, Emily, for many investors, the underlying motivation is to grow the value of the money that they invest in the stock market. And in the past, ethical and sustainable investing has been seen as not so profitable. Would you say that has changed in recent years?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, all investment carries risk, and investments do go up and they go down, and performance in the past is no indication to the future. But when we look at what happened during COVID times, the ethical sustainable portfolios did amazingly well. They really did hold up. And that was in part, a large part, because of what happened in the fossil fuel sector at that time. There was some international activity in the oil and gas sector that caused a fall anyway in the oil prices. And then with COVID on top, obviously meaning that there was less demand for fuel, the oil values went down further, which really did hit the conventional funds in a lot more dramatically than obviously the sustainable stocks that by and large didn't have exposure to the oil market. So the thing to remember about ethical and sustainable investing is that you've lost a little bit of the correlation. So what I mean by that is it's not going to behave in the same way as ethical and sustainable investing. You'll have good times for the conventional stocks. You'll have good times for the ethical and sustainable stocks. Sometimes you'll have good times for both, but it does depend on what's happening in the economy. But on the whole, if you look at long-term performance, that there doesn't seem to be the discrepancy that there once was. And like I said, during the COVID period, ethical and sustainable stocks actually performed better. But if you look essentially at what certainly the sustainable companies are doing, and also the ethical ones too, is that they are building businesses for the long term. They are making sure that their practices and their operations are kind to people and planet. And with that in mind, should any legislation come down the line, and it most certainly will when we realise that our net zero target is very, very challenging, which we're starting to already, there will have to be more drastic with the legislation that's introduced. And those companies that were already in compliance voluntarily will not be hit as badly financially as the ones who have just been living for today and not being worried about acting in an ethical, sustainable way because frankly they didn't have to, because the legislation wasn't there in the past. It's being forward thinking that makes you a much more financially resilient stock. So I think if you bear that in mind, you would hope that, and of course no guarantees, you would hope that the ethical, sustainable funds and portfolios are going to be more resilient and not as subject to certain shocks that might be coming down the line.
Yeah, I think they are now coming into their own, and as you've said, we've seen that happen during the COVID pandemic, and a lot of the conventional companies are focusing a lot on the future and, being more energy efficient. They're talking about, being carbon neutral. They've got targets. So some of those conventional companies, which may not have seemed as ethical and sustainable a couple of years ago, are slowly becoming more ethical and sustainable. Again, it's partly down to changes in legislation, but also individual investors using their votes to say, look, we're not happy with the way things are being done. You need to change, or we will move our money elsewhere.
Yeah.
Emily, this has been a really fascinating and informative conversation. Thank you so much. I have learned quite a lot about the whole ethical and sustainable investing theme. As you know, I believe that to create true wealth, we must all be clear on what wealth means in each area of our life. So going back to the whole thing about values, in a few words, could you please share with us what wealth means to you in terms of your physical, mental, spiritual, social, and financial well-being?
For me, I always think about the most important thing being to live your best life. And living your best life isn't about having the most money in the bank account. It's about choosing to do things with your money that make you happy. But also around that, the very, very most important things are health. Because if we don't have our health, even though we have money in the bank and we know what it is that makes us happy, it might not be physically possible for us to do it. So I think we all have to look after our health first and foremost, physical and mental. I also believe very strongly in education. I think to be feeding your brain and challenging yourself and making it grow can keep you very spiritually and mentally healthy. And I believe that making sure we're taking care of our planet as well, because all of those other things, if we've got those, great. But if we've got a planet that's on its knees, what's the point in that? We want our children to have a great future as we do our grandchildren. And that's why I just hold, this kind of investing so dear to me, because it is our future. It has to be our future, and it will become mainstream. And I really hope that people listening have thought a bit about how their pensions are invested and their ISAs, and perhaps look at it through a different lens.
Thank you so much, Emily. How can anyone listening to this episode get in touch with you?
Well, you can reach me on Happy Planet FP. That's the same address on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn under the name of Emily Poole. I should also say that I am launching my own podcast, shouldn't I?
Oh, yes, of course. Yes.
And it's with a lovely friend of mine, Janine Coney, who is a style coach. A little bit of an interesting collaboration, but we both approach things from a different spectrum. So I thought it would make for a good conversation. But the podcast is called Invest in Yourself. And she's talking at it very much from the point of view as, making sure that you are giving yourself self-care and spending your money in ways that is going to enhance your future, your well-being, and how you look is part of that, by the way, which is where the style comes in. And then I'm also wanting to talk to women, I guess it's for women primarily, about how investing in yourself is also about investing in your long-term financial future. So I'm excited about that. Look out for that in the new year.
Fantastic. I love the title, and I love the ethos behind the podcast. I can't wait for you to launch. Thank you so much, Emily, for being such an amazing guest and for sharing so much information on ethical and sustainable investing.
It's my pleasure, Tsitsi. It's been lovely. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Connect with me at The Wealth Conversation on Facebook and Instagram so we can continue the discussion. Also, if you're ready to define what wealth truly means to you, then go to thewealthconversation.com and download the Wealth Cornerstones Guide. Until next week, stay focused on becoming the designer of your financial future.